Good morning. And thank you very much for coming this morning. It's a chilly Wednesday morning, going to be a beautiful day. This is the first in a series of 3 meetings that we will hold on forecasting of enrollment and budgets. So there's this meeting. The next meeting will be November 6th. There is a change of time to 9:30 to 11. Our original time conflicted with a Senate meeting, so we've changed it to try and make sure we're being as open and transparent as possible. And then December 4th is the proposed budget, which will be the President and Vice President Strickland talking to you about the outcome of these first 2 meetings. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleagues. My name is Faye Gilbert. I am the Interim Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost, as well as Dean of the Undergraduate School of Business for the Maine Business School. But this transparency in budgeting is a path we're on. Dr. Hecker's also leading us there this year in terms of looking at ways to increase input, discussion, and understanding of how we set our budgets and where it comes from. So please ask questions or ask questions at the end, either way, and on we go. Claire.
I'm Claire Strickland. I'm actually Chief Business Officer for the University of Maine and the University of Maine at Machias. And please, if I'm not speaking loud enough for the people in the back, please raise your hand. Okay, so I'm not speaking loud enough, Betty.
No, speaking loud.
Oh, good, thank you. That was a thumbs up. Okay, so if I do, if I'm not speaking loud enough, just feel free to raise your hand. So the first slide is simply a calendar of how we project credit hours. And you've seen this timeline in multiple budget presentations that we've had over the years. But this timeline is going to provide a little bit more transparency in what goes on as we build the budget for the next fiscal year. So this timeline represents the calendar year that we currently are in. We are in July. The fiscal year that we're in right now is called FY20. It started in 2019 and ends in June of 2020. But for right now, we're actually looking ahead, even though we've just finished a quarter for FY20. During the summer, we're actually working ahead to predict enrollment for fall of 2020, which is fiscal year FY21. So we're actually 18 months, sometimes 2 years ahead of time in trying to predict our credit hours or projecting our credit hours. So we basically begin in July in the summer, and we look at what we have for credit hours at that time, and we continue to refine and revise our projections for credit hours, in-state, out-of-state, graduate, undergraduate, NEBI, Canadian, until we reach October 15th, which was just yesterday. October 15th is a magical date in enrollment management. It's a capture date for credit hours, full-time equivalents, headcount for the fall semester of the current fiscal year, the current academic year. And we tend to continue our projections until that time, and then we try to lock it down a little bit so that we can start working on what revenue will we have for the next fiscal year, for FY21. So I think I just spoke to this, we're using our census data that was amended yesterday, that was put into place yesterday, and that's what we will use to project next year's credit hour enrollment. And Deb Allen will give you the process we use to do that. So it's a little bit more this year is looking under the hood. Usually in our budget presentations, you see this timeline and then we go on. We go on to budget, we go on to everything. This first presentation is to give you a bit more information as to what we do under the hood of enrollment management and credit hour projections. So what is important here is that in projecting credit hours, we need to remember that for FY20, the current fiscal year that we're in right now, without any numbers behind it, tuition and fee revenue is 61% of our revenue base for FY20. Our state appropriation is 29%, and all other revenue represents 10%. In that 10% is indirect cost recovery, sales and services for athletics, and this is just educational and general funding. Steve?
Question out of ignorance. Back one slide, you mentioned the magical date of yesterday to impact the 2021 budget?
Correct. And then we'll go.
But it doesn't influence the 20? I mean, wouldn't it influence the 20 budget?
It absolutely influences the 20. We projected our credit hours for this fiscal year last fall and through November and December, and I can speak to this now because it'll come up later. We had a tuition projected credit hour enrollment that we used to build the current fiscal year, the fiscal year that we're in. And then as we gave our official budget to the Board of Trustees in May to approve our budget for this fiscal year, we were looking at May confirmations that were coming in on May 1st. And at that time, we looked at what we had budgeted for credit hours, and then we looked at what the confirmations were looking like. And for the first time in, I can't remember, because I've never done it before, we had to amend our credit, our projection for this fiscal year in the middle of the summer. The system office gave us permission because we knew we wouldn't hit the projection that we had given and approved in May. We knew we weren't going to hit that credit hour enrollment. And so we went through a process to reduce our credit hours and ultimately to reduce our expenditure budgets right in the middle of the summer. And the deans were wonderful in helping. There was a lot of work done over the summer, but the Board of Trustees approved an amended budget at their September meeting just this past month. And so we're working from that base to project next year. And we'll give you, there'll be so much more information as we move forward. Does that answer the question? I tend to go on, so.
No, that's great. So it serves kind of two purposes, but yeah, thank you.
So we're all set. Any other questions before I hand it over to Deb Allen? I think I'm all set. We're here. And then Deb, you can introduce yourself.
So I'm Deb Allen. I'm the Assistant Provost in the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment. I have been doing the projections for, I think, 9 years now. So the method I'm describing to you, we've been doing since we projected for fall of 2011. So when we project, we look at the three groups of students. So I'm just going to go over our method first. So students are grouped into the degree-seeking undergraduate category. This is about 90% of our credit hours that are in this category. Then we have our degree-seeking graduate students, who are about 7% of our credit hours, and our non-degree students. And our non-degree students are students who are not seeking a formal degree or certificate. They might be taking a course as a non-degree student. They also includes our visiting students who are coming here to study abroad, and our high school students. And our high school students make up about 1/3 of that population. So when we project for our degree-seeking undergraduate students, which, as I said, is the majority of our credit hours, we project those students who are coming back using a continuation rate model that I'm going to explain in a minute. We then build onto that assumptions about the size of the incoming first-year class, transfer class, as well as assumptions about how many readmits we're going to have and spring admits. So these projections are all based on projecting fall credit hours. Our degree-seeking graduate students, we work with the graduate school to determine what would make sense for the following year. We have been holding the graduate credit hours flat, and in some years increasing a bit for in-state graduate credit hours. For non-degree students, we typically hold the credit hours for non-degree students flat unless there's a strategic change that we expect will impact enrollment for non-degree students. So I'm going to describe our continuation rate model. So this continuation rate model looks at the probability of students returning the following fall. So it's a very simple model. It takes who's here now, what do we expect the percentage of those students, what percentage of those students will return, and how many credit hours do we expect them to take when they return. So it's very simple and transparent. And it allows us to track the continuation rates as you go through time. So as we build the model, we typically look at the continuation rates for the current year compared to the prior year, so we get a sense of whether or not there was an increase or a decrease in the continuation rates. So it allows us to track that over time. We also use it and base it by tuition residency. So we build an in-state model, an out-of-state model, and a NEBI model. And this is important because of the difference in the tuition rates. So the in-state students pay about $300 per credit hour, and our out-of-state students pay about 3 times that per credit hour. So there's a big difference in the revenue brought in. Our NEBI students are students who are eligible for the New England Board of Higher Education reduced tuition program, I think, that is dependent on their major and their state that they come from. So those students pay about 1.65 times the credit hour for an in-state student. And our E-rate students pay about 1.25 times the credit hour. So it's important to split everything out that way because the retention rates differ across those categories. So we need to make sure to capture that along the way. And this model works well with fluctuating incoming class sizes. So you'll see in a minute that we split everything up by the class level that students are at, which has been really important over the last 5 years. We've seen a lot of fluctuation in the size of the incoming class. From 2015, we had a class of 2,047. In 2017, we went all the way up to 2,299, and we're now at 2,140. So we've seen a lot of fluctuation with the incoming class, so it's important to capture that as you look at students as they flow through their 4 to 6 years. Our continuation rates, so we calculate the rates, and then we usually develop 3 different scenarios. One, we base on a weighted 3-year average of our continuation rates. So for that version, we weight most heavily the most recent year continuation rate, and then we weight less heavily the prior 2 years. And then we have an unweighted average where we just average the 3 years. And we also have a version where we just look at the most recent year. Depending on the year, they could vary a bit. Sometimes they're similar. This year, we've run the models and they're quite similar. So this is an example of what this looks like for a template. This is an example of the in-state model. So on the left, these are students by their class level, basically their class standing. So we have continuing first-year students. Continuing first-year students are students who are not new. They're not incoming first years, but they are students who have just not yet reached the 24 credits to become a sophomore. Our new first-year students are students who are incoming first years this year. Then we have our sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And so what we do is we look at how many students are currently here, and this is based on yesterday's information. So this is yesterday as a fall census. So we've been working on this for the last month or so, and we usually do this along the way using a projection of a projection to get the fall census. So now we're able to use the final fall census numbers. So in column B is the student return percent assumption. So this is based on the percentage of students who were here in fall 18 who returned this year. So for example, last year, sophomores, in-state sophomores, 82% of the students who were here last year as sophomores have continued this year. So we're assuming that 82% will continue next year in this model. So we then just multiply those two out to get to the projected students that we expect to return next year. And then we need to estimate their credit hours. So we have to look at the average credit hour load for the students in each group that they take the next year. So typically it's a little bit lower than the first year. So For example, you can see your sophomores, when they return the next year, their average credit hour load is 14.4. The new first-year students, when they come back for their second year, they're still taking about an average credit hour load of about 15. So we typically see our first-year students, the average credit hour load is actually a little bit above 15. And we've seen that since about 2016 when we saw the jump in our average credit hour loads. When you get, as you can see, as you go down in the class levels, that we have an average credit hour load that is lower for juniors at 13.8 and seniors for 11.5. And this is why it's important to make sure you're capturing the class level as you do your projections and able to pick up that fluctuating class size, which I'll talk a little bit more about later of how that is impacting fall 20's projections. So to come up with the estimate, we multiply the average credit hour load by the number we expect to be returning, and that gives us our estimate of total credit hours for returning students. And these are the total credit hours for the in-state, in this example, the in-state returning students, undergraduate students, which we then add to assumptions about our incoming class, our transfers, our readmits, and our spring admits, because this is based on fall to fall, as well as our non-degree and grad. The total continuing student credit hours makes up about 58% of our total credit hours as we go through the model. So as I mentioned before, we've been doing this somewhat in the same way since we projected for 2011. These are the error rates that you can see for going back to 2015. And we've had a lot of success, we feel, with this model. So in fall 15, we projected 136,002 credit hours. And we came at 134,000, so we were 1.4% down. But you can see from the right, so the left is the overall credit hours and the right is the incoming first year credit hours. So that right side of that 2015 fall, we had a lower than projected incoming class. So that spoke to the reason why we were down in credit hours. For fall 16, and this is the first year, the flagship match, we projected 136,917 for credit hours, and we came in just a smidge over 337,000 credit hours. So we were really right on target for that rate for total credit hours. For our incoming first year class, we actually came in slightly above where we projected. And then fall 17 and 18, we were also pretty close at 0.5% above in 17 and 0.4% below in 18. So we were pretty close in those years as well. So we feel like this has been a good model in the past. This past fall, as Claire mentioned, we had an original estimate that we did last fall that we projected 143,000 credit hours, which was based on a much larger increase in the incoming class. When we got to June and realized that we were not seeing that occur, we revised our projections and we revised them to be 139,579. Now these credit hours that I'm showing are excluding IEI and bridge year credit hours because they don't pay the standard tuition. So this total 139,531, this is the total credit hours as of yesterday, excluding 80 IEI and bridge year credit hours. So we were really right on target when we projected in June. We were a little bit under in our first year class. We projected originally at 2170 and came in at 2140. But we did see a little bit of a bump in retention over the summer that after we revised the projections. So that's how we ended up on target. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our first year class before I get into the 2020 projections. So our first year class, this summer we started to look a little bit more at the market share that we're seeing in our terms of our first year class. So this table right here, we use the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education data to help us look at what percentage of high school graduates from public and private high schools, and this is high school graduates regardless of whether they go on to college or not. So this is total graduates. And we use that to look at what percentage are we ending up with at UMaine. And you can see that for Maine, it's at about 8% for fall 16 through fall 18. This is consistent. We looked all the way back to 2000. It has ranged between 7% and 9% every year since 2000. So this is a very consistent percentage. For our New England, we were at 0.46% in fall 16. And again, that was the first year of the flagship match. So prior to that, the New England percentage was a bit lower. And we bumped up to fall 17 to 0.54%. Fall 17, we had a really big bump in our out-of-state enrollment for our first year class. So that's, you can see that there. And then we went down a little bit in fall 18 with 0.51%. And we looked at the Mid-Atlantic and other states as well, but those percentages, because there's so many students in those states, they're really minuscule percentages in those states. So this column shows you the average, the 3-year average, looking at 2016 through 2018. So it's about 8% for Maine and 0.5% for New England. This year, as of yesterday, and this is estimated because we don't have the final numbers for the public and private high schools, but we're estimating to be about 9.25% of market share in Maine this year. Because we had a really big bump in our in-state class with this first year classes coming in. We saw a large increase in our, in terms of market share for our incoming first year students. And we saw a drop in New England, 0.39%. So we dropped a bit in the out-of-state. So our 3-year average is 8.58% and 0.47% for the most recent 3 years. So what we did was we looked at these market share rates, and we went to the as I mentioned, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, the WICHE data that we often talk about in budget presentations, project high school grads. I think the most recent one, which was put out in 2016, goes out to 2032. I think that's as far as it goes out. So they use live birth rate data as well as high school grad data to project out. So we looked at what would have we just recently did this over the summer to get a gut check on what seems reasonable for the size of the first year class. So if we had taken the average market share from 16, 17, and 18 and projected out for fall 19, we would have been at about 22.18 if we had been able to hold on to that same market share. And that's applying that to the projected high school graduates in the WICHE data. We actually came in, as I mentioned, at 2140. But what you can see here, this is where you see that bump in the market share in in-state. We were at 1,328 in-state students and 776 out-of-state students, plus 36 international students. So you can see we had that bump in the in-state. If we look further out and go out to fall 2020, which is what we're projecting now, you can see that the total incoming class size is about 2166 if we were to project that out. And again, this isn't perfect. It's just a kind of a gut check to see if 2150 seems reasonable, which I'll show you in a minute. And so if we do this projection, I mean, that's 1180 for in-state and 950 for out-of-state. The WICHE projections show a big dip because you can see the 2218 versus the 2166. The WICHE projections show a big dip in the size of the number of high school graduates between last year and this upcoming year. So that's what that dip is. And again, it's not perfect, but it's a way to get a sense of what we can expect if we hold on to the same market share. And so going out, we see pretty stable totals until we get to about fall 2023 when there's another dip down to 2143. So that brings us to, are there any questions about the methodology before I move into what it looks like for 2020? So I'm going to talk a little bit about fall 2020, and this is what we're projecting now based on data from yesterday. And as I mentioned, we've been working on this for a couple months so we could just finalize everything based on final census data. So we're projecting an incoming first year class. Right now we're working with an incoming class of 2150, which is 10 more than we have this year. We have 2140. 1332 for in-state and 818 for out-of-state. That's the same proportions that we saw this year. So this year we're at 62% in-state and 38% out-of-state this year. For incoming transfers, we're projecting 475, which is 10 more than we have this year. We're at 465 right now. We're working with continuation rates. We're using the fall 18 to fall 19 continuation rates, assuming that will be the continuation rates for this next year. We're assuming the same number of spring 20, we're assuming we'll have the same number of spring admits that we had this past year in 19, because at this point it's too early to really know where our spring admits will land. And for graduate enrollment, we're at this point, as we do this first realistic scenario, we're holding that flat. So this year we were at 2131 for graduate enrollment as of yesterday. And then we're holding flat our non-degree enrollment as well. Our early college, excluding bridge year, was 308. Non-degree undergrad was 262, and non-degree grad was 281. So if we use it flowing things through the model and using those assumptions, this shows us what our first pass at this, what our realistic projection is for fall 2020. So what we're projecting is 138,581 for total credit hours. That is 950 fewer credit hours than we had this year. So right now we're comparing to 139,531. So that's 950 fewer credit hours and 57 fewer students. So, and that's about 0.7% down. And thinking about, this is where that flow of in-state, out-of-state students and that incoming class size comes into play. Because what we're seeing is the fall 16 class that came in was 21, a size of, I think it was 2166 was that class. Right? Is that right? I'm sorry, it's 2230. 2230 was the fall of 16 class. Sorry about that. 2230 was the size of the fall of 16 class. That was the first year of the flagship. That class was also 57% in-state and 43% out-of-state. So that we're taking, if you think about the flow as we go through 4 years, those students, the bulk of those students will be leaving after this year. And we're somewhat replacing them with an incoming class that's smaller at 2150 relative to the 2230. And also, we're assuming in-state percentage of 62% versus 57%. So a smaller percentage of these students will be coming from out of state. So that's what leads to this drop in the out-of-state credit hours of 843. Further, the fall of 17 class will now be seniors. And as I showed you earlier, the further you go down, the seniors, their average credit hour load is notably lower than the first years and sophomores. So that big class of fall 17, and that fall which was 2299, and that fall 17 class was pretty much almost 50-50 in-state, out-of-state. So those students will be producing fewer credit hours. So we always kind of think about this flow of students through, given such a large portion of our students are degree-seeking undergraduates, traditional degree-seeking undergraduates. That we kind of use that flow to kind of have that straight face test of whether this seems reasonable. Okay. So I'm going to pass it over to Claire now.
And I'm going to stay on this slide just for a minute or so. Please bear in mind that this is a, whoops, what did I do? This is a fall 2020 realistic projection, and this is just the fall semester. And we lose tuition for the spring semester is approximately 93.5% that we retain from fall to spring. So this loss in credit hour for the academic year, for the fiscal year as a whole, would probably be about, it's actually $15.99 the way we've projected, down from this fiscal year. So we're anticipating 1,600 fewer credit hours in categories that we've explained as we're modeling the budget for fiscal year 21. Hopefully I haven't confused too many people. So,
Claire,
yes.
just a clarification. You said between the fall and the spring you retain about 93.5%?
Correct.
That rides pretty close to how we track our housing too. We lose about 7% between fall and spring.
So that's affirmation that
Yep.
we're both sides. So Dan Startup is our Executive Director of Auxiliary Services who works in housing and dining. So that's a confirmation of how we retain students for the spring semester. So the next slide is basically showing projected changes in revenues versus expenses in FY21. Please remember that we're still at the very beginning of projecting revenue. We're closer on the revenue side now. And projecting expenses. We're right at the cusp of projecting expenses. But what we can see, and the dollars are to be determined, what we can see is that with a loss in credit hours and including a tuition increase rate, tuition revenue will be relatively flat. Our state appropriation is scheduled to, if the supplemental budget at the state is approved for FY21, it's yet to be approved. We'll know for sure in mid to late November. It's not going to be voted on until January. Right now, we're projecting if we do get that, it'll still be relatively flat. The increase in state appropriation, should the supplemental budget be approved, is about $11,000, but 16 still sticks in my mind. So it's a little over $400,000. The expense side are known factors. You've seen these factors on a yearly basis. We have compensation increases that will become effective in FY21. We have benefit adjustments that are scheduled to go up by 0.8%. We have financial aid that we need to look at, shared services expenses, funded depreciation that are mandated by the system, utilities increases, insurance, and then we always try to put in strategic investments. And so this is where we are right now with no dollar signs here to try to determine what the changes will be vis-a-vis a relatively flat revenue and increased costs.
Lest you be about to go into doom and gloom, it's important to understand we're not helpless and hopeless. That enrollment management is busy as we speak, doing a lot of things. They're going to fairs, they are contacting students, they do direct mail outs, they are trying a December 1st early application deadline for premier scholarship awards. By that time, if they get their packets in by December 1st, they're gearing up for 1,000 applications a month. We generally have 14,000 to 14,500 applications, from which we then have the 2150 starting class of freshmen. The hope is to move toward 20,000 applications. The funnel you may have heard about, if you can start wider in the funnel to have more applications, you can generally yield a slightly larger freshman class. So they are all about it, and they're focused on that corridor that has traditionally yielded the greatest return of students selecting University of Maine and coming here for their higher education. So what can we do to assist enrollment management? The size of the incoming class is important. This Saturday is open house, right? Starts at 8, goes till noon. So there'll be a sizable group on campus, and the parents love to meet faculty and staff. They love to see us in the field house. The few times I've been in the field house, what I've been impressed with is us. That as a group, we tend to be very warm, welcoming, informative, and the people are reassured, and that's an important part of turning out a freshman class. Our graduate enrollment is important, and the number of graduate programs we're offering or considering developing. The number of programs we're considering or developing for non-traditional students. 90% of our students are traditional undergraduate here. That's unusual for institutions of higher education that are pushing the envelope. And so beginning to develop things for non-traditional students, the certificates that bring them in, all of those things are going to assist over the next 2 to 5 years as we look at the projections for New England and Maine and begin to provide counterbalancing measures. Continuation rates, retention, Our retention rate last year was 71% freshman to sophomore, 72%,
Probably 73, yeah.
72 or 73%.
Yeah, yep.
Be nice to have that hit 80%. You know, but you can't, sometimes you can't hold on to them. There's financial reasons, there's performance reasons, but for us to take that bar and decide to the extent possible, we want to assist students in succeeding. I've never seen a faculty and staff better at doing that than the faculty and staff I've seen here. You know, so that caring of, you know, I'm not going to give it to you. You're the faculty. You can't. The grade is not a gift. Santa Claus is not coming this December. You know, it is though important for us to put into place those retention strategies that assist students in succeeding in their courses so that they stay and graduate and succeed and go on with their efforts. And credit hour loads, think 30, so that they're sticking with that 15 hours and we're encouraging them to make progress toward degree and to take full loads and go forward, and everyone recruits. That's not my phrase. I don't remember who it came from, maybe somebody in admissions or enrollment management, but everyone on the campus is a recruiter in every contact they make, everywhere. I mean, not just with the students on the campus, but with your, in a barber shop or your hair salon, you know, getting coffee at I always call it the wrong thing, Aroma Joe's, is it Aroma Joe's? Oh, right. So the whatever it may be that you're talking up humane in your colleagues, we're somewhat good at that, but we are also here, my personal opinion, a little humble. And so we tend to not speak right out with, you should hear what's going on at the University of Maine. You should see what my colleagues are doing in forestry or in education or in the library, you know, anywhere else, so that you begin to really pay attention to the good news of UMaine and you talk about it. And I know that sounds trite and simple, but we're not helpless and hopeless. It is up to us to begin to forge a future that can counteract some of these demographic trends within New England, Maine, and really nationwide. So this is the start of 3. The next one we'll be talking about allocation and different models we might want to consider and principles we may want to consider in allocating budgets to help us make sure that we are fostering our strategic investments and that we are plotting a course for the future that works together.